October 1964. The Royal Peacock Club in Atlanta, Georgia. A Friday night, packed house. Little Richard was on stage doing what he always did, commanding every eye in the room, screaming, sweating, pounding the piano with a violence that felt religious. He was the architect of rock and roll, the man who taught the Beatles how to scream. And he knew it. Behind him, barely visible in the stage lights, a young guitarist stood with a white Stratocaster. 21 years old, quiet, almost invisible. His name was Jimi Hendrix, though he still spelled it with a Y back then. He'd been hired 3 months earlier to play rhythm guitar in Little Richard's backing band, the Upsetters. The job was simple. Play the chords, stay in the pocket. Don't move, don't solo, don't draw attention, just be a shadow. Little Richard didn't hire guitarists to be stars. He hired them to make him look like a star. The spotlight belonged to Richard Penniman alone. That was the deal. The money was decent. $35 a night, sometimes more. Room and board on the road, but you stayed in your lane. For the first few weeks, Jimmy did exactly that. He played rhythm, simple Chuck Berry-style licks. He wore the uniform. He stood in his spot on stage left. He kept his head down. But something was happening he couldn't control. People were noticing him, not because he was trying to be noticed. Jimmy wasn't the type to seek attention. He was shy off stage, soft-spoken, polite to everyone. But when he played guitar, even when he was trying to play simply, something happened to his body language. His fingers moved differently than other guitarists, faster, more fluid. He'd bend a string in a way that made the note cry. He'd add little fills between chord changes that weren't technically solos, but weren't exactly rhythm either. And slowly, night after night, people in the crowd started watching him instead of watching Little Richard. Little Richard noticed. Of course he noticed. Richard noticed everything on stage. He had antennae for attention, a sixth sense for when energy was flowing somewhere other than directly to him. And what he was seeing troubled him. During a show in Macon, Georgia, Richard looked out at the crowd during Tutti Frutti and saw a group of young women in the front row. Their eyes weren't on him. They were watching the quiet guitarist on stage left, watching his hands move across the strings. Richard's voice got louder. He pounded the piano harder, but the girls kept watching Jimmy. After the show, backstage, Richard called Jimmy over. The rest of the band was packing equipment, laughing about something, unwinding. Richard's voice cut through the noise. "Jimmy, come here." Jimmy walked over, guitar case in hand. "You know what your job is?" Richard asked. "Yes, sir. Play rhythm guitar." "Play rhythm guitar," Richard repeated. "Not lead, not solos, rhythm. You understand the difference?" Jimmy nodded. "Yes, sir." "Then why are you playing so many notes?" The question hung in the air. Jimmy didn't know how to answer. He wasn't trying to play many notes. He was just playing. "I'm just trying to support the song," Jimmy said quietly. "Support the song by playing less," Richard said. "Play the chords, nothing else. When I want a solo, I'll tell you. Until then, disappear." Jimmy said nothing, just nodded and walked away. But something had broken. Jimmy tried to play simpler. He really did. For the next few shows, he focused on being invisible. Just chords, just rhythm, just support. But his fingers wouldn't cooperate. They'd find their way to little melodic runs. His body would start moving to the music, and the attention would shift again. 3 weeks later, Jacksonville, Florida, the Ritz Theater, middle of the set. Little Richard was performing Long Tall Sally, one of his signature songs, the one that always brought the house down. He was giving everything, sweat pouring down his face, voice reaching those impossible high notes that made audiences lose their minds. The crowd was ecstatic, dancing, screaming, completely under his spell. This was the moment. This was why Little Richard was Little Richard. The band was tight that night, drums punching, bass walking, saxophone wailing. Jimmy stood in his position on stage left, playing the chords exactly as written, keeping time, doing his job. But the music was working on him the way it always did, getting inside him, making his body respond. And then, during the instrumental break, something happened. Jimmy's fingers found something they weren't supposed to find. A phrase, a run of notes that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't a planned solo. Jimmy wasn't trying to upstage anyone. He was just responding to what he heard, the way a conversation partner responds to a statement without thinking about the response. The notes poured out, bent strings crying like human voices, rhythmic accents that syncopated against the drums in ways that made people's heads snap toward him. The guitar suddenly sounded like it was talking, like it had something urgent to say. It had a voice separate from the piano, separate from the drums, separate from everything else on stage. The notes weren't louder than Richard's piano. They weren't technically flashier, but they had a quality that pulled focus, an authenticity, a rawness, a directness. For about 15 seconds, Jimmy played. Just 15 seconds, maybe 20 at most. And in those 15 seconds, the entire energy of the room shifted in a way that was unmistakable. People moved closer to the stage. The dancers stopped dancing and started watching. Women who'd been screaming Richard's name went quiet, transfixed by this unknown guitarist. And little Richard, still singing, still performing, still giving everything he had, felt it. Felt the attention leave him like air leaving a room. Felt it move to the guitarist he'd specifically, explicitly told to stay quiet. Richard finished the song. The crowd applauded. But Richard knew what had just happened. His authority on that stage had been challenged. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but challenged nonetheless. After the show, Richard didn't say anything. He paid the band, smiled, acted normal. But everyone could feel the tension. The other musicians knew something was coming. They'd seen this before with other talented players who'd briefly worked for Little Richard. Players who got too comfortable. Players who forgot their place. 2 days later, Pensacola. Before the show, Richard gathered the band. He looked directly at Jimmy. "Jimmy, this isn't working out." Jimmy looked up, confused. "What isn't working out?" "You, this. You're too flashy. You're trying to steal my show." "I'm not trying to." "I didn't ask what you're trying to do," Richard cut him off. "I'm telling you what you're doing. You're playing too much. You're drawing attention to yourself. This is my show. Mine. And I can't have someone in my band who doesn't understand that." The room went silent. The other band members looked at the floor. "You're fired," Richard said. "I'll pay you through tonight, but after this show, you're done." Jimmy stood there, holding his guitar case. He wanted to argue, wanted to explain that he wasn't trying to steal anything, that he was just playing the way he felt the music. But he also understood that nothing he could say would change Richard's mind. This wasn't about music. This was about ego. This was about power. This was about one man's need to be the only sun in the solar system. "Okay," Jimmy said quietly. "Thank you for the opportunity." He played that final show, played it perfectly, stayed in the background, played only chords, made himself as invisible as possible, and then he packed his guitar, took his pay, and left. No drama, no scene, just walked away. That night in a cheap motel room outside Pensacola, Jimmy sat on the bed with his Stratocaster across his lap. He didn't play it, just held it, trying to understand what had happened, trying to figure out what he'd done wrong. He'd followed instructions. He'd tried to disappear. But his fingers wouldn't stay quiet. His body wouldn't stop responding to music the way it needed to respond. Was he wrong? Was there something broken in him that he couldn't just play rhythm and nothing else? Other guitarists could do it. Other musicians could stay in their assigned roles. Why couldn't he? He thought about going home to Seattle, maybe getting a regular job, maybe accepting that professional music wasn't for him if being professional meant suppressing whatever it was that came through his hands when he touched strings. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't do it, couldn't do it. The guitar was the only language he'd ever spoken fluently. So he stayed on the road, took whatever gigs he could find, played behind other artists who'd allow him a little more freedom, learned to navigate the politics of being a backing musician while holding on to the part of himself that needed to express something beyond just keeping time. Years passed. Jimmy became Jimmy, changed the spelling of his name, moved to London, formed The Experience, released Are You Experienced, became the guitarist everyone was talking about. The quiet backing musician who once played behind Little Richard became the man who redefined what the electric guitar could do. And Little Richard watched it happen, watched from a distance as the kid he'd fired became a legend. Watched as Jimmy played Monterey, Woodstock, the Fillmore. Watched as every guitarist in the world tried to copy what Jimmy was doing. And Little Richard felt something complicated. Pride, maybe. Regret, certainly. And guilt. In 1989, 19 years after Jimmy's death, Little Richard sat down for an interview with a music journalist. The conversation turned to Jimmy. Richard had talked about Jimmy before, always saying nice things, always claiming he knew Jimmy was special. But this time the journalist pushed harder. Why did you really fire him? Little Richard paused. The performer's mask dropped for a moment. His voice got quieter. I didn't fire him because he was bad, Richard said. I fired him because he was better, and I couldn't handle it. The journalist waited. That boy had something I never had, Richard continued. Freedom. I was trapped in my persona. I had to be Little Richard every second. Screaming, wild, the architect, the originator. I couldn't just play music. I had to perform being Little Richard. But Jimmy, he just played. He was himself. And people responded to that authenticity in a way they never fully responded to my performance. Richard's eyes got distant, remembering. When he played behind me, even when he was trying to be quiet, trying to disappear, I could see it. The audience could see it. This kid had something real, and I was jealous. Not professionally jealous, existentially jealous. He could be free, and I never could be. Do you regret firing him? The journalist asked. Every day, Richard said, but not for the reason you think. I don't regret it because he became famous. I regret it because I let fear control me. I could have learned from him. I could have let him lift me up instead of pushing him away. But I was too scared, too insecure, too trapped in needing to be the only star. Richard leaned forward. You know what the worst part is? Jimmy never held it against me. Years later, after he was famous, someone asked him about working with me. And he said, Little Richard taught me about showmanship, about commanding a stage, about giving everything to the audience. He was generous to me when I'd been small to him. That's who he was, and that's who I wasn't. The story of Little Richard firing Jimi Hendrix became one of those legendary music industry tales. A cautionary story about ego, about insecurity, about what happens when someone feels threatened by talent instead of elevated by it. But the real story, the one Richard told near the end of his life, was sadder and more human. It wasn't about a boss firing an employee. It was about a man so trapped in his own performance that he couldn't allow authenticity to exist near him. It was about someone choosing self-protection over growth. It was about fear winning. Little Richard and Jimi Hendrix never worked together again after that night in Pensacola. They'd see each other occasionally at industry events. Richard would always make a point to talk to Jimmy, to be friendly, to act like everything was fine. And Jimmy, gracious and kind, would always respond warmly. No grudge, no bitterness. But both of them knew what had been lost. A collaboration that could have been extraordinary. A mentorship that could have changed both of them. A friendship that never had a chance to develop. Richard lived with that knowledge for decades. And in his final years, when interviewers would ask about his greatest regret, he wouldn't talk about songs he didn't write or albums he didn't make. He'd talk about the quiet kid with the Stratocaster he fired for being too good. I thought I was protecting my position, Richard said in one of his last interviews. I was actually just revealing my weakness. Jimmy showed me who I could have been if I'd been brave enough to be myself instead of playing Little Richard all the time. But I wasn't ready to learn that lesson, and by the time I was ready, he was gone.